Not too long ago, I came across these photos of stone huts somewhere up north. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen in Western Australia. The location was a bit vague, however, so the search began. All that I knew for sure was that they were found near the edges of Lake Austin and the former Austin townsite. The location of the Austin townsite can be found off Great Northern Highway, about 15 minutes south of Kew. That was obvious and even listed on Google Maps. But where were these huts? Street view was surprisingly good in the area, but all I saw was red sand and rocks where the town supposedly once was. Lake Austin is an expansive salt lake, covering approximately 14,000 square kilometres. The lake can fill with water if there is heavy rainfall, but anecdotally this only happens about twice a decade. The Austin townsite can be found on the island. I put that in quotations since it's not really on a conventional lake. Regardless, the island measures approximately 2 by 5 kilometres. Because of this, the town was alternatively known as the island Lake Austin, or simply also Lake Austin, complicating research. Even Trove wasn't that helpful. That's where I usually get the most aha moments during research. Instead, it was mostly just early 1900s prospectors bragging about their gold discoveries. I would personally be keeping that to myself, but I digress. The modern history of the area goes back to 1854 when it was explored by the surveyor Robert Austin. He would describe the area as, quote, very indifferent, but named it the Great Inland Marsh nonetheless. Later, the town and lake would be named after him. Funny really, since he obviously didn't rate the area. He also noted that the geological features indicated riches within, but it wouldn't be until decades later that prospectors would start trying their luck. By the early 1890s, it was estimated that there were between 300 to 400 prospectors on the Murchinson goldfields. The island would receive its first mining lease in 1892. From there, what were simple prospector camps would eventually morph into a townsite. Let's explore the former township, try not to fall down a mine shaft, and find those incredibly unique stone huts. Behind me is the townsite of Austin. Welcome! Jokes aside about falling down mine shafts, I feel obliged to start with a big safety warning. If you do decide to visit, be warned that the landscape is littered with hundreds of mine shafts that aren't always signposted. Many are quite old, deep, and even the surrounding ground can be unstable. I didn't go anywhere near them personally, as tempting as it was to peer down the shafts. Visit this location at your own risk. I started on the western side of the highway, where the train station and cemetery were supposedly located. The railway arrived in 1898 and contributed to the growth of the area considerably. This ran from Marlowa to Kew, with Austin receiving a train station. Before that, the only public transport was a bi-weekly coach from Yalgoo. This stretch hasn't seen a locomotive since 1978, however. There's not a lot to see, even the tracks have been pulled up. Later in my trip, I travelled along the Geraldton Mount Magnet Road and noted all the rail remained for that portion, so it's interesting that they decided to pull it up here. Regardless, there is quite a substantial concrete platform remaining, indicating that this would have been a sizable train station. One benefit of this side of the highway is that you're quite close to the shoreline, if that's the correct terminology in this scenario. In my research, I read a fantastic article on the Dusty Box, a website I've mentioned on this channel before. It explores the story of how skeletons were discovered under a tree in the 1930s, near the south shore of the lake. It's believed they were prospectors, but they had been there a long time. Most of the metal on their boots had rusted away, and they were partially buried in the sand. The article goes in depth about the investigation after the grisly find, and the mystery of who these skeletons were. I'd highly recommend giving it a read. And speaking of skeletons, there is a cemetery on this side of the highway too. We couldn't find it, however. I read somewhere that it was near the train station, so we walked up and down the rail corridor. We also explored around the lake edge, particularly where there were groups of trees, but gave up when we saw fresh snake tracks. It's a shame I didn't see this map before my trip, even if it is approximate. I did end up spotting it, but not until the next day as I was leaving Kew, on the way to Geraldton. I decided not to stop, as I had a decent number of other projects to film that day and only so much daylight, but a website called Outback Family History shows some photos if you're interested. Find it linked below. Back across the highway, I explored where the town once was. It was a very difficult town to research. What we do know is that there were at least 2 hotels, the Miners Arm Hotel and the Railway Hotel, the latter of which included a general store. Other businesses listed in late 1800 and early 1900 postal directories include an amalgamator, bakers, drapers, blacksmiths, butchers, a cafe, carpenters, engineers, general stores, and either a soft drink supplier or manufacturer. There was also a 10-head stamp mill on the outskirts of the town. Having said that, it never had a high population like Kew or Mount Magnet. It peaked at 191 in 1905, but dwindled after that. Even by the 1930s, only about 20 people lived here. This photo shows what was left of the town in 1950, a small cluster of buildings that made up the Railway Hotel. This itself was gone by the 1960s as the train service slowly decreased. I'm not sure if much of the gazetted land was ever built on, but there certainly isn't a lot to see now. While some of the buildings were made of stone, most were constructed with corrugated iron or was simply a tent. Once it wasn't tenable to operate the larger mines, most of the building materials were hauled elsewhere as everyone moved on. All I could find were some footings, concrete slabs, and a sizable amount of rubbish. I thought quite highly of this tiled floor, however, built using flat pieces of ironstone that would have been found locally. If you requested such a floor in a new build, you'd be paying through the nose. Speaking of the ironstone, it was time to explore deeper into the island and find those huts. Luckily, there's only one track, and it led me right to them. Once you're over the horizon, you'll start to see the mine shafts and other workings. You also quite quickly spot the huts. This makes sense. There were a few larger mines, like Golconda, but the island was mostly home to smaller operations which were owner-occupied, and they built the housing right where they worked. Speaking of Golconda, I'm led to believe this is the remains. Another sizable operation, the Eureka mine, can be found nearby. I'm not interested in those, however. We're here for the huts. These were usually constructed on high elevations to catch the breeze. They were built with flat pieces of ironstone found locally, just like the tiled floor from before. It is very rare to find such examples intact. Evidently, they were built well, since most are still standing after 130 years. I felt like I was walking around an open-air museum of sorts, but we can't forget that this is how they lived. It wouldn't have been an easy life, and I assume most never struck it big. Some didn't even get to leave. Checking out the cemetery website from earlier, most buried there died young from mining-related accidents. Supposedly, these are the only known examples in Western Australia. That is according to a very specific newsletter about stonewalling anyway. I can't confirm that, and honestly I hope it's not right so I can explore other examples. If you know otherwise, please let me know. The building techniques suggest the prospectors were familiar with stonewalling, possibly from constructions in their home countries. Majority of the prospectors would have been immigrants from Europe. The best examples I found were slightly further south down the island. This one even had a roof, although I'm unsure if it's original. An inherit listing from 1995 claimed that none of the huts had a roof. You can tell a lot of effort went into the construction. The miners evidently planned to be here for a while. The dwellings include windows, doorways, fireplaces, and even shelving built into the walls. I wasn't sure about this location in the research phase. It was hard to know what to expect since the information out there is so scattered, but I'm really glad I visited. This is easily one of the coolest and most unique locations I've ever explored, especially for this channel. If you're interested in the rest of this filming trip, where I also visited locations around the Geraldton and Kalbarri regions for videos, I've released a behind the scenes vlog for the channel members. There's also a vlog for a separate trip based around Kalgoorlie and the goldfields. The support program is just $3 a month and can be cancelled at any time. That $3 includes the extra content, shows your username at the end of the videos, and also highlights any comments you might make. All money earned goes right back into the production of future videos. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.